Imagine a child barely into her teens, walking the cold stone corridors of an English manor, already carrying the weight of a nation in her womb, 13 years old, not yet a woman, yet destined to give birth to a king. Lady Margaret Beaufort's story is one of power, ambition and tragedy, but it begins with an unthinkable moment, a pregnancy that would shape the future of England and leave a young girl forever marked by secrets and survival. In an era where crowns were more important than childhoods, Margaret's life became a chess piece in the game of dynasties. Her body, her fate, her innocence, all consumed by the ambitions of those around her. What drove this girl, so young, so fragile, to endure a world that demanded obedience over joy, strategy over love? How did she survive the treacherous currents of 15th century England and rise to become one of the most influential women in English history? This is not just a story of royalty, but a story of survival, cunning, and the relentless grip of ambition. Behind every corridor, every throne, and every whispered alliance, there is the shadow of a child forced to grow up too soon, a girl whose womb would carry the future king. If you enjoy hidden truths like this, hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. But to understand her journey, we must step back into a world on the brink of war, where every birth, marriage, and betrayal could decide the fate of a nation. The 15th century in England was an era defined by bloodlines, power struggles, and civil war. The country was torn apart by the Wars of the Roses, a brutal conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York, each fighting for the throne with a ferocity that left families shattered and kingdoms vulnerable. In this chaos, noble lineages were not just family trees, they were lifelines. Every marriage, every child, every alliance would tip the balance of power. Lady Margaret Beaufort was born into this world in 1443, a descendant of the Lancastrian line and thus a potential heir to the throne. From her earliest days, she was not merely a girl, she was a symbol, a vessel through which the ambitions of kings, nobles and schemers would flow. Her father died when she was very young, and her mother's position in the court ensured that Margaret's upbringing was steeped in the language of strategy and survival. Toys and lessons of etiquette mingled with the heavy awareness of her importance, the knowledge that her future marriage would be dictated not by love but by politics. England itself was a nation on edge. The monarchy was fragile, the nobles ruthless, and the idea of succession a matter of life and death. Margaret grew up in a world where a girl's worth was measured by her ability to produce heirs, to solidify claims, and to serve the ambitions of her family. In such a world, innocence was a luxury few could afford. Yet even in these formative years, Margaret demonstrated intelligence, resolve, and a remarkable understanding of power dynamics. She learned early that survival required cunning, that patience was as potent as a sword, and that every alliance carried hidden consequences. These lessons, learned in childhood, would prove essential when her own body became a battlefield, and her womb the instrument through which history itself would be rewritten. The stage was set, a girl barely entering adolescence poised at the intersection of personal tragedy and national destiny. But the true test of her resilience would come sooner than anyone could have imagined. By the age of 13, Lady Margaret Beaufort had become a pawn in the games of men far older and far more powerful than herself. Her first marriage, arranged when she was barely able to comprehend its implications, was not for love but for politics. Her husband, Edmund Tudor, was himself a young man of status and ambition, the half-brother of King Henry VI. In this union, Margaret's role was clear, to bear a child who could secure dynastic continuity, a link in the chain of England's turbulent royal lineage. And yet, the reality was harrowing. At just 13, Margaret found herself pregnant, a child thrust into motherhood before she had truly become a woman. The pregnancy carried not just personal risk, but political danger. In those days, childbirth was perilous, particularly for someone so young, and every complication could have sparked political turmoil. But Margaret endured, navigating the complexities of courtly expectation, the silent pressures of her family, and the omnipresent gaze of a society that saw her body as a vessel for dynastic power. It was during these years that Margaret's character truly began to emerge. She was not a passive girl swept along by circumstance. She observed, she learned, she adapted. Every conversation, every courtly maneuver, every glance from a noble or a king became a lesson in survival. She began to understand the subtle arts of influence, how to inspire loyalty, how to negotiate favor, how to assert her presence without drawing dangerous attention. These skills, born out of necessity, would later define her reign over her own destiny. And then in 1457 her child was born, Henry Tudor, the future Henry VII. Margaret's son would one day end the Wars of the Roses and establish the Tudor dynasty. But in that moment, he was a fragile infant, and Margaret herself was a young girl navigating the terrifying intersection of motherhood and politics. Every decision she made could mean the difference between survival and death, both for herself and for her child. The rise of Lady Margaret Beaufort was not measured in wealth or titles alone, but in resilience. She learned to wield influence in a world that sought to control her, to transform vulnerability into power, and to turn the tragedies imposed upon her into instruments for shaping history. And yet, even as she began to assert herself, the forces around her were gathering. Ambition, jealousy, and betrayal were never far away, and the true dangers of her life were only beginning to surface. The turning point in Margaret's story was not a sudden betrayal, but a slow accumulation of pressure and peril. As her son grew, so too did the political stakes. The Wars of the Roses raged on, and every Lancastrian claim was contested by Yorkist forces determined to erase her family line. Margaret's position, once relatively secure, became precarious. Survival was no longer guaranteed. It demanded cunning, courage, and a willingness to make morally complex decisions. Margaret quickly learned that her influence was most potent when exercised quietly. She began to weave alliances, correspond with exiled nobles, and cultivate networks of loyalty that spanned the kingdom. Yet each step carried risk. The wrong move could invite suspicion, imprisonment, or execution. The court was a place of constant calculation where even small gestures could become fatal errors. At the same time, her personal life was fraught with challenges. Margaret's early marriage had left deep emotional scars. She had experienced the loss of youth, the fragility of her own health, and the constant anxiety of protecting her child from the lethal machinations of enemies. Every decision was a test of endurance: how to nurture her son, secure her family's legacy, and survive in a world where childhood had been stolen and innocence was considered a liability. It was during this time that Margaret's intelligence and strategic skill came to the fore. She orchestrated her alliances with precision, balancing ambition with subtlety. She became the architect of her own survival, the invisible hand guiding her son's path to the throne. Her choices were calculated, and yet they were born of necessity, forged in the furnace of adolescent trauma and political danger. This was the crucible that transformed Margaret from a girl forced into premature motherhood into one of the most influential women in English history. She was no longer simply a pawn, she had become a player, a force capable of shaping the destiny of a kingdom. And yet, with every maneuver, every secret correspondence, the danger intensified. One wrong step could undo everything she had endured, and Margaret Beaufort knew it. The consequences of Margaret's early pregnancy and calculated maneuvering were profound, not only for her own life but for England itself. Her youth had left her vulnerable, and yet the ambitions of the powerful pressed relentlessly against her. She endured personal hardships, the trauma of early motherhood, the anxiety of safeguarding her son in a volatile political climate, and the loneliness of navigating a world in which few could be trusted. The larger consequences were no less severe. England's fragile monarchy was perpetually on the brink of collapse. Yorkist and Lancastrian factions plotted, betrayed, and fought to assert dominance. Margaret's son, Henry Tudor, was seen as a threat to entrenched powers, and her efforts to protect him required constant vigilance. She was forced to hide, negotiate, and occasionally deceive allies and enemies alike. Every decision carried life or death stakes. Even as she maneuvered with brilliance, the personal cost was immense. Margaret's health was repeatedly strained by pregnancies, stress, and the burdens of political responsibility. Her relationships were often transactional, trust a rare commodity. She became hardened, a woman whose survival depended on foresight, patience, and an almost ruthless pragmatism. The innocence of her childhood, lost to premature motherhood, could never be reclaimed, and yet these dark consequences were not without purpose. Margaret's trials forged a woman capable of guiding her son to the throne, ultimately ending the Wars of the Roses and establishing the Tudor dynasty. Her suffering became a crucible that produced not only personal resilience but a lasting legacy. But every triumph was shadowed by the memory of a childhood stolen, of a girl forced to carry the weight of England before she could even understand what it meant. Margaret Beaufort's story is a reminder that ambition and survival often come at a terrifying cost, and that history is rarely kind to those who bear its burdens at such a tender age. Margaret Beaufort survived. Against impossible odds, she navigated a world of intrigue, betrayal, and danger to become one of the most influential women in English history. Her son ascended the throne as Henry VII, and the Tudor dynasty was secured. Yet beneath the triumph lies a story of loss, sacrifice, and the heavy price of political power. She humanizes history. Margaret's life reminds us that even the most extraordinary figures were once children, vulnerable and unprepared for the forces that would shape their destinies. Her resilience, intelligence, and strategic genius were forged in trauma, yet they allowed her to protect her son, manipulate her environment, and survive in a world where few women wielded genuine influence. Her story also highlights a broader truth. Power and ambition are often intertwined with suffering. Margaret's early pregnancy, the challenges she faced as a young mother, and the constant threats from rivals shaped not only her life but the course of English history. It is a reminder that behind every throne and crown lies a network of human struggle, calculation, and sacrifice. Today, when we remember Lady Margaret Beaufort, we must remember both the triumph and the tragedy. She endured what few could imagine: a stolen childhood, early motherhood, and the relentless pressures of a kingdom in turmoil. Her legacy is both cautionary and inspiring, a testament to resilience in the face of impossible odds and to the enduring influence of one woman who refused to be defeated. Subscribe for more, share this story, and tell me in the comments what shocked you most. Because the tragedy of Lady Margaret Beaufort is not just history, it is a story that reminds us how deeply the past can shape the lives of those who come after.